We have joining us next, we have a guest who's lucky for me, been on many times on our show, Chang. He is an actual, just a international expert on China, written books about China. He's a widely viewed as an expert on China and the Chinese Communist Party and Hong Kong and the work the Chinese government has done around the world in trying to expand its power and control over the world, frequently quoted in many different places in the national news. So I want to be sure that I tell you this is a real expert we're talking to, and there's so many things I want to ask him about China, given in fact, there was a statement that even though we don't yet have the report out of DNI Ratcliffe, who's now saying it's going to be Monday, but he, part of the statement that was issued earlier in the week about can't have the report ready by Friday, but there was reference to there was interference in the American election by China, Russia, and Iran. And so therefore, it's just so timely that we happen to have Gordon Chang available to join us on America Can We Talk. And so without further ado, hi, Gordon.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you so much.
Great to see you. Love having you on the show. Well, I sent you a bunch of topics, and I want to run through them. I just think the American peoples need to understand the depth of penetration of the Chinese Communist Party in America, the determination on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to, in one way or another, grow its power around the world, and especially in America. It just couldn't be more important as we're facing this election cycle and the ongoing dispute about who actually won our election. So let me start with this. I didn't know this till this morning. I was looking at your Twitter feed and a bunch of other things. You'd given a statement about that the Chinese Communist Party is working to acquire the DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, of American citizens and others in the world. Can you tell me how they're doing that and why would they be doing that?
Well, first of all, they're doing it a number of different ways. So, for instance, they're actually acquiring companies with DNA profiles. So, for instance, the 2013 acquisition of Complete Genomics by BGI. BGI is a private Chinese company, clearly gave them a big head start. Also, they've been providing at subsidized rates genetic sequencing information to all sorts of U.S. companies, including the ancestry groups. So if you have, you take a swab, you send it in, you want to find out who your ancestors were, well, you're basically sharing that information with China. These companies from China have research collaborations. They've got all sorts of partnerships with U.S. companies in DNA and genetics. And whatever they can't get legally, they've been stealing. So, for instance, the hack that was discovered or released in January 2015 of Anthem, the second largest American insurance company, that was China. China got a lot of information about Americans, perhaps 80 million of them. So there has been a persistent effort. At the same time, China is preventing Chinese research institutes, companies from sharing the DNA of Chinese people with foreigners. Now, there's two reasons why I think they're doing this. First of all, they want to be big in biotech. Biotech is one of the 10 areas that was identified in Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 initiative, which is an attempt to dominate 10 industries. Second of all, I believe that they are looking at developing, if they haven't done already, biological weapons that are targeting specific ethnic or racial groups. Bill Gertz of the Washington Times quotes a U.S. official saying that China is in fact doing that. Also, we don't have to rely on that reporting. We can see what the Chinese themselves are saying. So the 2017 edition of Science and Military Strategy, Strategic Strategy, has a section, and this is published by the Chinese National Defense University. It's an authoritative publication, and it talks about specific ethnic genetic attacks that the Chinese military is thinking about how to do. So you put all that together, and we've got to be concerned. Because, Debbie, if you want to find the biggest database of the DNA of Americans, don't look in America. The place that you find that is China.
Okay, this is so alarming. I have to tell you that I am pretty much 24/7 news hound. I read so much. I had no idea this was occurring. I'm not surprised they would be doing it. I'm just surprised because I don't hear this reported very many places, or people certainly hear expression of concern about the idea that China is actually intentionally growing a database of Americans' DNA, and I guess other people in the world too, but Americans' DNA. And actually, you're talking about the effort, you were talking a moment ago, you're talking about actually using this for the purpose of the Chinese developing bioweapons to which Americans' DNA would be more susceptible than that of the Chinese people. Is that correct? That's
certainly correct. And the Chinese make no bones about this because, as I mentioned 3 years ago, they actually publicized this. And this fits in with the behavior that we've been observing over the last couple of years, that this is one of their goals. You know, China actually brags a lot about how they've dealt with the coronavirus much better than the United States and other societies. And, you know, how a society deals with the COVID-19 is many things. But one of them could very well be the susceptibility of certain populations to certain types of diseases. And the Chinese have seen proof of concept. A lot of people say biological warfare doesn't work. Well, I think that we have seen it. It does work. It's crippled American society. You know, it's killed about 311,000 Americans as of today. But what it's also done is it's put our society, and as we always talk about, it has crippled our economy. You know, it's changed American life drastically. So China has seen that societies are vulnerable to biological attack.
It is astonishing. And for all Americans who are thinking that somehow the concern about China is overstated, just this one piece of information, that China is consciously collecting the DNA of American citizens for the potential purpose as a future biological weapon use, it's staggering. So what can, I want to turn to many other topics, but so in response to knowing about this, what should America do?
Well, I think that the Trump administration should start to reverse some acquisitions of U.S. companies. So, for instance, a Harbin pharmaceutical company bought GNC, you know, the people who sell all sorts of supplements, because, you know, that company does actually have profiles of Americans' buying habits of these supplements. And if we can go back and unwind some of these prior acquisitions, we should do that as well. We should make it illegal for any American institution to have a research partnership with a Chinese institution. And clearly, we should be telling the ancestry companies and others that they can no longer have the DNA sequenced by a China or China-linked group. So these are simple things that we can do. I think that it's absolutely essential because we have seen what China has done with the coronavirus. They actually deliberately spread this disease beyond their borders. We don't know how this started, whether this was naturally occurring or whether this was an engineered bug that escaped from a lab. But we do know that China took steps, and those steps would inevitably lead to the spreading of the disease beyond China's borders. So this was malicious. And I actually think that at this point, we need to acknowledge that and decide that we need to end cooperation with China, because you can't cooperate with a country that has killed more than 300,000 Americans this year.
A country that wants to kill your citizens is not our friend. Okay, so you had a great piece up. I want to tell our listeners it's available at our website too, americacanwetalk.org, and it's called Espionage Emergency, China Floods America with Spies. It was a piece from Monday by you. It's at the Gaystone Institute, and it's just a great compilation of the variety of ways in which China invades, or my word, invades America, manipulates America, contorts American society and culture, and we're oblivious to it, or we actually think that some things that they're doing are kind of a sign of friendship and globalism and getting along with each other, or some such silly thing. So I'd like to have you talk about, they're, as I say, it's so detailed and full of examples, but just tell some of the highlights, the ways in which China, you call this actually, as China floods America with spies and espionage emergency. What are the top ways that they are doing this, the top vehicles for doing it?
Well, the Ministry of State Security has hundreds, probably thousands of agents in the United States. But we also know that China has hundreds of thousands of collectors of intelligence in the U.S. They have what's called a 1,000 grain of sand approach. Some people call it mosaic or human wave approach. And what they do is they interview returning business people, students, tourists, and they just get information. And they collate that information because they have big data and artificial intelligence capabilities. So they are overwhelming us. FBI Director Christopher Wray says that almost half of the counterintelligence cases that the FBI has are China-related, and that the Bureau opens up a China-related case every 10 hours. The FBI is just simply overwhelmed, so is law enforcement, and that means we're going to have to take some drastic steps. One example of this, Eric Swalwell. Now, it's no sin for a member of the House of Representatives to be targeted by Chinese intelligence. That's true of all 435 representatives and 100 senators. The sin is, and just the way they did this was not when he was sitting on the House Intel Committee, which of course would be of great importance to them. They first contacted him when he was a council member on the Dublin City, California Council. So they are grooming young American politicians, hoping they become more influential. And we are seeing just China go after our political system from top to bottom, not just federal offices, but local, municipal, state offices as well. And it's not just the government. They go after the media, educational institutions, NGOs and foundations, you name it. If it exists, China is looking at it.
Yeah, actually, I was going to bring up Swalwell, and exactly the point you were saying was that he had actually been contacted or identified and targeted before he was even in the U.S. House. And the woman that he got connected with is, I guess she goes by Fang Fang. But she has apparently been involved with other American, we talked about her earlier in the week or last week, with other mayors in America, a kind of very attractive woman who is a spy, who is holding herself out in America as a kind of a pal, a friend. She's helping building relationships with China and America. And she is very, very, very dangerously compromising people like Swalwell and others. And I love the 1,000 grains of sand approach, just how they it's a good description of the way gathering information all the time about America. It's like knowing your enemy is a way to destroy your enemy. You also, I want to talk about the Chinese embassies here in America, or the consulates, the Chinese affiliates here. And there was actually, I want to ask you specifically about the Houston consulate. Houston, Texas had a Chinese consulate, and it was closed down, I think, in 2019. And I think you're pretty familiar with that. If you can tell us, what was the reason that America shut down the Houston consulate from China?
Yeah, this was July of this year, Debbie.
This year.
State Department officially said that China was using Houston for intelligence gathering, espionage. Well, that's true of the other 4 consulates in the U.S. I think that it was because Houston was providing financial and logistical support for violent protesters. Yeah. Radio Free Asia reports that an intelligence unit of the People's Liberation Army based themselves in the Houston consulate. And from there, they used artificial intelligence and big data to identify Americans likely to participate in Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests. And then the Chinese military sent them videos on how to riot. The intelligence unit used TikTok, because these were TikTok videos, and equipment from Huawei Technologies, which is a Chinese telecom equipment manufacturer for this purpose. And this goes beyond subversion. This is an act of war, Debbie. And thank God the State Department closed it down. In that piece you talked about, I recommend that the U.S. close down all 4 of the remaining consulates, and that we cut back the embassy staff in Washington to just a few people, because we need to eliminate the bases of support for all of China's agents in the U.S. And this is an emergency. As I said, we can't cope with this. So we better figure out how to deal with this now, because as the Director of National Intelligence, John Radcliffe, wrote in his Wall Street Journal op-ed, China steals perhaps as much as $500 billion worth of U.S. intellectual property each year. Now, some people have lower estimates, Some people have higher estimates. But whatever it is, it's grievous, and we've got to stop it. And the only way to stop it fast is to close down these consulates, the embassies, and also go after the Chinese state banks and state enterprises that are in our country, because this is where China spies from.
Okay, I love all that idea. I love shutting all of them down. Those are kind of physical steps, and I'm all in favor of that. But in addition to those physical steps, which even if we removed every representative of the country of China here in America, everyone, you still have all of the hacking capacity. You can be anywhere and hack. And so we've got to be stepping up our suspicion of China and our ability to determine what they're doing. I mean, isn't that right? That getting them out of here is only about half the problem, right?
Yeah. First of all, I should point out that China's National Intelligence Law of 2017 requires every Chinese national to spy if demanded. And also, it's just the Communist Party's top-down system means that no individual can resist a demand from the party. So we should look at every Chinese national in the U.S. as a potential collector of information. That's not to say that everyone is doing that. It is to say, though, that we have reasonable suspicions. So, for instance, we have something on the order of 370,000 Chinese nationals who are students in our colleges and universities. The estimate is that 13% of them are actually involved in spying against us. And we also know that China's Ministry of State Security and consular officials monitor those students, pass along instructions to spy, and for other purposes. For instance, getting involved in our political processes, and that would be clearly inappropriate. So we put all this together, and it means that we have a lot of individuals in our country that we have to look at. And, I don't know exactly how you deal with this. My dad came here as a Chinese student and was allowed to stay, so I have a soft spot for all of this. But the point is, we cannot allow this situation to continue. So we do need to take steps that we would not have otherwise considered.
Gordon, I did not send you this topic ahead of time, and I can't believe I have to left off my little list to you, but there was recent announcement about the Chinese Communist Party membership list, or at least a portion of that hacked and information released. And obviously the information released from this hack about who are members of the Chinese Communist Party, it's in Mandarin Chinese, so people are scrambling to get it translated in English, but it is accurate, I believe. And I wonder if I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with all of this, what kinds of entities we're discovering in America actually have at top leadership levels, including Pfizer creating our vaccines and others, about people who are running or in serious positions of control at high levels in organizations and our government, and members of the Chinese Communist Party. So let me just start with this. Do you even know? Go ahead.
Yeah, you're referring to the revelation that was in the Australian, which is the Sydney paper, which showed that there was a hack of the names of 1.95 million members of the Communist Party. To put that in perspective, there are basically about 92 million members of the party. And what was interesting about the information that was released, and which is vetted by a number of different groups and is believed to be accurate, is that, of course, there are Communist Party members in American and other companies. That we've known because the Communist Party actually insists that large foreign companies have Communist Party cells in their operations in China. And the companies that were mentioned in the Australian report were Boeing and Pfizer, among others. And of course, Pfizer would be especially sensitive because China's been trying to steal coronavirus vaccine information. Yeah. What was really stunning, though, was the revelation that there are 10 consulates in Shanghai which have Communist Party members. They include countries such as the United States, Britain, and New Zealand, and Australia. And I mentioned those four because those are four of the five of partners in the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Coalition, which is really important for us because that's where we share our most sensitive intelligence. So having Communist Party members in the consulate obviously is a serious breach. We shouldn't, in a sense, be too surprised because we are required to hire Chinese nationals through a Chinese government entity. And of course, they're putting in spies. But we should not permit that. in our diplomatic compounds in China, we should have only Americans. Yes, it's more expensive, but the catastrophic loss of information is even more expensive for us. I mean, this is something that's not reciprocal because we don't require China to hire Americans for their diplomatic compounds. This is just completely unbalanced.
It's completely unbalanced, and honestly, it's scary. Given what you have talked about many times on this show and other places, the Chinese Communist Party's mission is not simply to maintain control, tyrannical control over the China mainland. It is an expansionist mission. They're looking for expanding the Communist Party's control, expanding the control of the Chinese people around the world. And so when you have high-level officials, whether they're in the compound in China, embassy there, or whatever the entity was called, you have people of other backgrounds, other national backgrounds, Americans and others, members of the Chinese Communist Party. It's like they're using those people to assist in this expansionist mission, or you can't trust your own people because you don't know whether they're on the side of the Chinese expansionist mission or they're on the side of the American, respect for freedom of all mission. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation for America.
Well, it certainly is, because it's even worse than you suggest, Debbie. There are a lot of people who say, oh, China just wants to compete with us in the existing international system. Well, that's not true. It's even worse than China trying to change the existing international system. China wants to overthrow that system and replace it with the notion of a mandate of heaven over Tianxia, which means all under heaven. In other words, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been hinting for more than a decade, and now his references have become unmistakable, that he doesn't want to live in this Westphalian system that we now have. He wants to replace it with this notion that there is only one sovereign state, and that is China. And that makes the U.S. a colony, that we should be, along with everybody else in the world, subservient to China. So this is exceedingly dangerous. The Chinese say this, and a lot of people say, oh, that sounds ludicrous. Well, yeah, it is ludicrous. But the point is the Chinese are, in fact, saying this. And by the way, they're also acting like Tianxia, mandate of heaven emperors. So we can't ignore this. We ignored Osama bin Laden. We didn't pay attention to him until, of course, he killed more than 3,000 Americans on 9/11. China is so much more powerful than Al-Qaeda. So we've got to understand this risk. The Chinese say this all the time. We just ignore it as if it didn't really matter. Well, yes, it does matter, because we're talking about American lives here.
Yep. Actually, you went right to the point I was going to go to, was I couldn't think of the name of it, the name of the kind of ancient doctrine, because the idea historically for the Chinese people, going back to the early Chinese dynasties, was the idea that the Chinese people were ultimately intended to rule the world, and that was it's a cultural belief, and that is the term for that is Tianxia. Is that right?
Tianxia, Tianxia.
XIA. Okay, I'm gonna spell it correctly here too. Okay, but then that mindset, and then compound that mindset with Xi Jinping, now obviously the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, communism itself a very repressive system, the Chinese Communist Party itself growing in its tyranny, repression, totalitarian conduct, and embracing this idea. It's a toxic mix of ideologies embraced by a country that we have been facilitating over the years by allowing unfair trade agreements to continue, allowing the theft of American property, American intellectual property. We've been kind of feeding that whole, the growth of that mindset in China. Is that accurate?
Absolutely accurate. Future generations are going to look back at us and say, how can we Americans enable China with trade, with investment, with technology partnerships, because we know that China takes the proceeds of all of this commerce and they use it to develop a military whose officers openly talk in public with glee about killing Americans. So, to me, it is just, I can't understand it. We got a lot of smart people in our country who say, oh, we need to cooperate with China and all the rest of it. That's engagement theory. Yeah. But engagement theory tells us that China will become benign as it becomes stronger. But as we've seen, especially recently, as China becomes stronger, it has become more arrogant, hostile, belligerent, and of course, dangerous. We've got to stop this because we've got to remember one other fact. May of 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, carries a piece that declares a quote-unquote people's war on the U.S. They've called us an enemy, and we're not paying attention.
Yeah, we're sure not. You know, you used the term earlier. I want to make sure our listeners recognize it. You used the term Westphalian, and in contrast to what China has intended. And that was that. Well, you can go ahead. When you actually told me about this in the past, but quickly tell us what that concept means, Westphalian.
Yeah, the current international system, which recognizes competing sovereign states, is called the Westphalian system, after the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. And China has been talking about how Xi Jinping has been transcending the Westphalian system. So this is dangerous because what they're also talking about is this notion of worldwide Chinese rule. You put those two things together, and it is very clear that they intend to rule not just China, but the entire world.
Gordon Chang, you always manage. You're so informative, a tiny little bit scary, but you're always very informative, and I really appreciate that. And I want to urge our listeners again to read the piece I mentioned to you. It's on our website, americacanwetalk.org. I do want to ask you, and I don't know if you have any political thought about this, but do you find it troubling that the governor in Georgia, Governor Kemp, met in the Houston consulate before they closed it with a gentleman? It wasn't, Xi Jinping wasn't there, but it was Lee, can't say his last name, Houston Consul General of the People's Republic of China in July of 2019. And within a few weeks after that, he committed to purchasing Dominion voting machines, which have now become the center of so much controversy. Do you think that's suspicious at all?
Oh, it's extremely suspicious because, as you pointed out, China took a $400 million stake in Dominion before the November 3 election. And remember, in the April 15th South Korea elections, China developed an algorithm that helped President Moon Jae-in win seats in the nationwide election for the National Assembly, which is the unicameral legislature. So China knows how to manipulate voting machines, and they were extremely successful in that particular contest. And, you know, I don't know if they did it in hours on November 3, but they're preparing to do it with that stake in Dominion.
Gordon Chang, thank you so very much. Is there any website or place I can ask our listeners, suggest them they go to your Twitter feed, which I read this morning. Twitter is at Gordon G. Chang, at Gordon G. Chang. Any other reference you want to urge people to go to read more about what you do and your work?
Yeah, it's basically Twitter and Parler are both Gordon G. Chang. My website is www.gordonchang.com. And this is where I just send out my thoughts about what China's been doing. So Twitter's probably the best place.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Twitter's great. I'm glad you're on Parler. I'm trying to move. It's so hard to make these changes, but I'm trying to move over to Parler too. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate that.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Debbie. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, sir. Okay. So that was Gordon Chang, folks. I tell you, this is a gem. It's a great thing to be able to have him join us, just full of great information that everyone should understand. And I think also he, along with other serious conservatives, are waking America up to the idea we have been duped by the multiculturalism, inclusive, left-wing happy talk into thinking that the enlightened view is to see one world government, or at least one world we all get along, we all love each other, we're all we're all going to equal, and we are just failing to recognize the threat that China poses to America. Gordon Chang does a brilliant job cataloging that one article I mentioned, and other articles as well, what America is up against in China and how we better just wake up and smell the coffee.